Welcome to ANTH A200 Alaska Native Cultures. This is our first module, Knowing Our Place, Purpose, and Perspectives. I'm your professor, Adam Dunstan. I want you to think about Alaska. What first comes to mind when you think of our home? Pause the video for a minute and write down 2 or 3 things. Okay, did you do it? Good. Now, what came to mind? Did you think about our amazing mountain ranges? Did you think about Anchorage? Did you think about our rivers? Did you think about the opportunities for fishing and hunting? There are a lot of things one might think of when you think of our home state of Alaska. But do you think about Alaska Native cultures? Because we really should. For one thing, Alaska was inhabited by indigenous people, by native people, for thousands upon thousands of years previous to it ever being discovered, quote-unquote, by Russia in the 1700s, or later becoming part of the United States in the 1800s. Furthermore, to this day, Alaska Native cultures are vibrant, critically important part of our state. Approximately 1 in 5 Alaskans, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but approximately 1 in 5 Alaskans is Alaska Native. And so these are, whether you are Alaska Native yourself or not, surely you most likely know Alaska Native people and will know Alaska Native people during your time in Alaska. Alaska Native corporations and villages and tribal entities continue to be some of the largest employers and healthcare providers in our state. All in all, what I'm trying to get at is that knowing about Alaska Native cultures is an incredibly important part of living and working in Alaska for some very practical reasons. But I think also for some more, how shall I say, philosophical would be the wrong word, perhaps even ethical reasons. I think it is critically important that we know about the native cultural diversity of the land that we are in, the land that we are inhabiting. And we come to this course with a variety of different levels of knowledge. Some people are from these communities, some people are not. Some people have a ton of knowledge about different Alaska Native groups, and some people have very little, and that's okay. And we can learn from each other. But that's, I think, we should acknowledge and start with the fact that this is an incredibly important topic to talk about. And in having taught this class several times, I've noticed that oftentimes students will express to me like, I learned very little about this actually growing up in Alaska, or I learned a little bit here and there in school, but relatively little. So I hope that this can be a class where we really do a deep dive into the history of Native Alaska, as well as the present day cultures of Native Alaska. So that's my sort of intro. Today, our goal in this first module is pretty straightforward, like a lot of, kind of first week lectures that you do in college courses. We're kind of just laying the groundwork. And so I want us to make sure, before we get started, that we know 3 things. Number 1, our place. Number 2, our purpose. Number 3, our perspective. So let me explain what I mean by that. First, our place. This is the gigantic subcontinent of Alaska. And when you look at Alaska, that's one way to look at it without any of the borders on it. Another way to look at it is to think of it in terms of the Alaska Native languages and communities that Alaska was traditionally divided among. And so this is a map of that. You've probably seen this map previous, but it's kind of a reconstruction of historical territories, but it's a pretty good one. You'll notice that most of us in this class, if you live in Anchorage, or if you live like myself down here in the Kenai Peninsula, or if you live up in Matsu, that the vast majority of us live in what was traditionally the homeland of the Dena'ina people, who are an Athabascan-speaking group. And so that is why, I like to start this course by saying Denainak, Elnenak, Jeshu, Geshnu, Chku Yeshtu. And forgive me, my Dena'ina pronunciation is not as good as it could be, but what that means is I live and work in the land of the Dena'ina. And that's a translation by Joel Isaac and Sandra Shaganoff-Stewart, 2 UAA professors. And what that's saying, though, is, pretty much all of us, or I should say most of us that go to this university, we live and work in the land of the Dena'ina. And so we should learn about, the native histories but also the native present day, right? The present day cultural diversity of our state and of our place. Now, when we talk about our place, we mean partly a place in space, so Dena'ina Ethnena, the fact that we live on Dena'ina land, that we live on native land, but also I mean a place in time, a place in history. And so, for example, if we went to this page, which I've provided a link for in the slides, which, by the way, I always put the slides on Blackboard. This is a publication that was put out by the Anchorage Museum. It's called Dena'ina Time Travel, and it kind of shows a history of Alaska, talking about the native histories of Alaska, which again go back thousands of years, and then the Russian entrance into Alaska and colonialism of Alaska, and then the quote, sale of Alaska to the United States in 1867, and onward until statehood. And as we go along there, among other things, this is specifically with the Dena'ina focus, although we could talk about this history from any of the other 19 language groups here, we eventually start getting into things about colonialism, and some of this being extremely brutal colonialism, with massive epidemics, for example, that killed very large numbers of people, as well as violence that killed people, as well as human rights, for lack of a better word, atrocities, right? So things that went on during colonialism. And so part of knowing our place is knowing these histories, both the positive parts of histories, but also the hard parts of histories, and talking about what has come before us, our place in time. And my goal in talking about those histories is not to induce guilt in you. I generally do not think that guilt is a productive emotion for university learning. So if you are not from the native communities we'll be talking about, and if instead your ancestry or your background is a settler, like my own, again, my goal here is not to induce guilt because of a history that happened. Instead, my goal here is that we just have awareness, that we have knowledge, because ultimately you cannot understand the present day without understanding the past, right? So having an acknowledgement of both the land that we're on and the histories of colonialism by which that land became what it is today is not so much about inducing guilt as hopefully getting to a place of what I like to call a land relationship, where we can show respect and be aware of the diversity of our lands, of the histories of our lands, and that we can better understand this place we call Alaska.